Want to share with you an extraordinary contemporary account of a Viking attack on Islamic Spain. And I'm going to be reading from this book titled Ibn Fadlan and the Land of Darkness. And it contains many accounts by historians and chroniclers from the Muslim world a long time ago of various events. And one of them in particular is by a guy called Ibn Hayyan on the Viking attack on Seville in Spain, a city which is still there today, in 844 of the Christian era. Now, this book is published by Penguin Classics, and it introduces this account, which I'll read from in a sec, as follows. The chronicler Ibn Hayyan, who died in 1076, wrote the fullest and most reliable history of al-Andalus that we have. Now, what is al-Andalus? Al-Andalus was the name of the Muslim-ruled area of the Iberian Peninsula, what we would today call Spain and Portugal in Southwest Europe. And the name refers to the different Muslim states that controlled these areas from about 711 to about 1492. So it's basically Islamic Spain / Portugal. And this particular account, says the Penguin Classics, his work from which the following passage is taken is based on earlier sources carefully credited. Al-Razi, who died in 955, and his son, his sources for the Viking attack of 844 are among the earliest historians of Al-Andalus. So on page 105 of this book, we read the following. News of the appearance of the fleet of the Vikings, may God curse them. He always says, may God curse them when he mentions them. From the Mediterranean off the western coast of Al-Andalus in the time of the Emir Abdurrahman and their attack on his people and the great harm they did to his cities and to the Muslims, and how the Emir came to their aid and brought reparation, and what happened during this attack, insofar as we have been able to learn. For full knowledge belongs only to God, whose ways are glorious. This extraordinary introduction to his contemporary account of this attack. And then he quotes from Al-Razi, who said, quote, at the end of the year 229, that's a Hijri year, /844, the ships of the Vikings, who were known in Al-Andalus as Majus, appeared off the western coast of Al-Andalus, landing at Lisbon. Lisbon, of course, is today's Portugal, capital of Portugal. It was a Wednesday, the first day of Dur al-Hijjah, which is the 20th of August in that year. And they remained there for 13 days, during which time they engaged in 3 battles with the Muslims. Next, they went on to Cadiz, and after that to Medina, Sidonia. Now, when I first read, I thought Medina, Sidonia, I Googled it, and it really is a city in Spain even today. There, a battle took place with the Muslims, at which Lub ibn Musa was present, having received a safe conduct from the Emir, Abd al-Rahman. He had received a letter from Wab Allah ibn Hazm, the governor of Lisbon, telling him that along his stretch of coast, 54 ships of the Vikings had appeared, with 54 smaller craft and their crews, and that the Emir had immediately sent out letters to the governors of the coastal regions so that they might be warned to be on their guard. So here we have the leaders of the Muslims sending out the alarm, raising the alarm about the impending Viking attack. And it doesn't say, presumably the Vikings came from what we would call sort of Scandinavia, that kind of area. On Wednesday, after the 14th night of the month of Muharram in the year 230/844, the ships of the Vikings halted at Seville, which was undefended. So Seville is obviously a city in Spain today as well. That day, they plundered all they could, taking advantage of the negligence of its inhabitants. So he's quite critical of the Muslims at that time, who were presumably quite well off and quite luxurious, according to other accounts, and hadn't really properly defended themselves against potential attack. As soon as the news reached the emir, he writes, Abdul Rahman immediately sent his cavalry to the river. So the alarm was raised, the emir takes action, sending out his cavalry. They sent letters to the governors, telling him to proclaim a general call to arms to the Muslims to fight off these unexpected tyrants, whose unprovoked attack on a defenseless region was without precedent. People gathered from all sides and rallied at Cordoba. Cordoba, of course, is an area of Spain today. At their head was the eunuch Abu al-Fatah Nasir, the favorite of the emir, who hastened out with a great multitude and a very great show of force. So the Muslims finally rallied and counterattacked against the Viking. So he continues, meanwhile, the Vikings, may God curse them, he says again, had arrived ship after ship and occupied the city of Seville. They spent 7 days there, killing the men and enslaving the women and children until the commanders arrived and clashed with them again and again, causing more and more casualties until the death toll began to have an effect on them, and it became clear that they had been defeated. So eventually the Vikings were defeated. The greatest battle against them took place on a Wednesday, when there were 5 nights left of the month of Safar in the year 230/844 at the village of Tejada near Seville. God destroyed many of them, and they died there, and 30 of their ships were burned, and many of the dead were hung from posts, and others from trunks of the palm trees of Seville. A ghastly scene. From the day that they entered Seville and overcame its inhabitants to the day of their defeat and the final departure of the survivors was 40 days. So it's 40 days of, today we call this a terrorist attack, wouldn't we? Didn't call it that then. So 40 days of battle and strife and pain and agony. God caused their leader to die and reduced their numbers, and news of the victory was sent to the provinces, not only in al-Andalus, but also to the Berber emirs of the North African coast. They were sent the heads of the leader and his 200 paladins. Paladins, again, I didn't know what that meant, and I look it up. Apparently it means warriors. God calmed the agitation of al-Andalus, which had shuddered at such audacity against its people and the defiance of its power, and dispelled its fear. So peace was restored to the people. Isa, who was the son of al-Razi, another chronicler who our writer draws on, remarking on this news, said, and I quote, "The fleet of the Norsemen, i.e. the Vikings, may God destroy them," he says, "coming from the Western Sea, which is adjacent to them, seized Seville at the beginning of the year 230, September 844. This is his account. The first point at which they disembarked was the island of Isla Minor, some way up the river, a place dedicated to horse breeding. They disembarked on the Sunday, 12 nights after the beginning of Muharram, which is the year 230 of the Hijra, the 29th of September 844, and their ships were 80 in number." I love how the exact date, the 29th of September 844 is when this happened, and we know there were exactly 80 ships of the Norsemen, of the Vikings. On the second day after their arrival, 4 ships were sent off to Del Rio, which stands on the banks of the river, to the west of the city, inhabited by Yemeni Arabs from Yashub, known as the Bani Mahdi. So the Yemeni Arabs living in the Iberian Peninsula at that time. Very interesting. They immediately sacked the village and killed everyone they encountered there in a great attack, the first they had carried out against the Muslims. Then, the third day after their arrival, the Norsemen, may God curse them, the kind of ritual denunciation and condemnation of them, may God curse them, and sent out in the direction of the city of Seville. When they reached the Church of the Water, and were already close, the Muslims of the city and others who joined them decided to fight off the infidels. They sallied out against them, filled with great courage and determination, but without discipline. You get this sense of just people rushing out to fight the invaders, to fight the Norsemen, but without discipline. So guess what happens? Guess what happens? They had no designated leader, not even a standard bearer, because the governor had deserted and fled to the city of Carmona, leaving them with no support on which they could rely. When the Vikings approached the town from the river, the weakness of the people and their diminishing numbers were clear to them. So they set out in their ships after them, shooting flight after flight of arrows against them, so that they scattered. Then they disembarked and fought them on the river most vigorously and with relentless pressure, so that the civilians, in other words, the Muslims, were put to flight, and none of them stood their ground. Most of them fled back to the city, each going his own way, trying to escape, for the Vikings burst upon them, attacking any who remained, who were weak or stubborn, and their wives and children of those who fled, killing, seizing, and enslaving. They remained in the city 7 days, looting and showing no respect for what is sacred. So these are clearly seen as uncivilized barbarians. These were awful people, terrorists who are coming in, killing, pillaging, and no respect for what is sacred. Then, he writes, when 8 nights of the month of Muharram remained, that's the 9th of October, they set out laden with their booty and loaded it onto their ships. They returned to their original encampment, where they remained for several days. They allowed the ransom of prisoners and children, but at the same time they were enraged against the inhabitants of the city who had fled. So they returned to the attack, determined to exterminate them. The people, however, were prudent and did not return nor appear at all. When the Vikings got to the city, they found not a soul there, except for a small number of fugitives who tried to defend themselves in a mosque. This is quite heartbreaking, this. So you get a few number of people seeking refuge and retreat in a mosque. They were surrounded and all were killed, for which reason it came to be known henceforth as the Mosque of the Martyrs. The Mosque of the Martyrs. News soon reached the Emir Abdul Rahman. He was very angry and sent letters to the districts and frontiers, telling them to mobilize their people and to hasten to come from all parts. Again, the alarm is called, come, come, defend the innocent Muslims. The first measures were taken by Ibn Rustam, who set out for Seville with a troop of horsemen, who quickly reached the district where the Vikings were established and began to set traps for them. They set up an ambush at a place called Tablada, 2 miles south of Seville, next to the river. Ibn Rustam sent some of his swiftest men, chosen from among the frontier guards and others, to head for the city and provoke skirmishes with the Vikings, who were occupying it. This was a Friday, when 9 nights remained of the month of Safar in the year 230, or in European Christian terms, the 7th of October, 844, and a very precise calendar date here. The Vikings, seeing that the attackers were few in number, hurled themselves against them. They moved their ships down the river in parallel and disembarked in great numbers to fight and pursue them until they reached the village of Tejada, where the commander Ibn Rustam and the bulk of his troops lay in ambush. When the Vikings had gone past them, the Muslims sallied out against them. The Muslims who were fleeing suddenly turned back against their pursuers. They just kind of turn around. And who had given up the chase, dismayed at what had happened. So the attackers, the Vikings, were shocked. They weren't expecting this sudden reversal in the attack. They suffered a terrible defeat in which God awarded their heads to the Muslims. More than 1,000 barbarians were killed and 400 captured. Only those who hastened to the ships, fleeing and terrified, escaped. They embarked and defended themselves from on board, abandoning 30 ships, left undefended by their crews, who were either dead or captive. Ibn Rustam halted before them, ordering that the captives should be beheaded in front of their companions, which increased their terror. Meanwhile, the Muslims took possession of the empty ships and burned them all. The enemies of God, shamefully defeated, withdrew. Thanks be to God. And there ends Ibn Hayham's account of this extraordinary Viking attack on Seville in 844, taken from this book, which I highly recommend. Fantastic read. Now, I wanted to show you just very briefly a few words about al-Andalus itself, because this is a really, really important period in history when the Muslims were predominant in civilization in many, many fields. And I want to share how they were. I'm going to read just a paragraph or two from this marvelous book, Lost Islamic History, Reclaiming Muslim Civilization from the Past. And on page 144, we read this. The peak of the Umayyad state in Spain occurred during the reign of Abd al-Rahman III from 912 to 961. During his almost half century in power, he declared himself as caliph of the Muslim world. Abd al-Rahman was a true patron of the arts and sciences, on the same level as the earlier Abbasid al-Ma'mun and the later Ottoman Suleiman the Magnificent. Over 600 libraries dotted Cordoba, the capital, just the capital alone, 600 libraries. Its largest library boasted a collection of over 400,000 books in a multitude of languages. Shops were numerous in the city, producing goods that were valued throughout Europe. Leather, silk, paper, wool, and crystal were all produced in Cordoba and traded throughout Europe as well as the Muslim world. It was a world-class city that served as a bridge between undeveloped, generally illiterate Europe and the great cultured cities of the Muslim world. See, at this time, historians in the West traditionally see Europe as going through the Dark Ages, a time when nothing happened, it was very backward. But of course, it's not true. Parts of Europe were going through a dark age, but that this center of glorious civilization in Europe was in al-Andalus, and it was a world-class city in contrast, highly literate, highly civilized, full of culture, learning, and science. As he says, it was a world-class city. If a European wanted to be well educated, where is he going to go? Well, they would travel to al-Andalus to be in the presence of its great scholars and libraries. Even a 10th century leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Sylvester II, studied in al-Andalus in his youth and was mesmerized by the scientific achievements of Muslim civilizations. Even a pope in his earlier years benefited from Muslim science and learning and civilization in al-Andalus. In later centuries, when the first universities opened up in Italy, France, and England, much of their libraries were made up of Latin translations of the works in Cordoba's library. Muslim Spain was the main thoroughfare through which the accumulated knowledge of the Muslim world made its way into Europe, helping spark the Renaissance in the 1400s. I'll leave it there, but there's a fascinating chapter, al-Andalus, here in this book by Firas al-Kitabi, al-Khatib, beg your pardon, Lost Islamic History. Really recommend this volume. It really is an absolutely extraordinary story. It goes from pre-Islamic Arabia, the life of the Prophet, upon whom be peace, the intellectual golden ages, the Islamic sciences, al-Andalus, and so on. Absolutely fascinating. So there's an amazing story. I want to share that with you, the Viking attack on Islamic Spain. And I might in future, inshallah, read from other accounts. This is the contents page. Many different historians and chroniclers from the Muslim world over 1,000 years ago wrote of their experiences around the globe. Many are very, very interesting. So I might share some of these as well, inshallah. Until next time.